England, 1455. A kingdom on the brink. The once mighty realm that had nearly conquered France now teeters on the edge of civil war. For 30 years, blood will flow across England's green fields as two great houses, York and Lancaster, battle for the ultimate prize, the English crown. This is the story of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic struggle that would tear England apart, reshape its monarchy forever, and give birth to the Tudor dynasty that would define England's future. Our tale begins not on the battlefield, but in the troubled mind of a king. Henry VI, son of the legendary warrior Henry V, ascends to the throne as an infant. By 1450, this gentle, pious man has grown into a monarch utterly unlike his father, meek where his father was bold, indecisive where his father was resolute. The king has lost France and his wits, whispers the court. And these whispers spread as English territories in France, hard won by generations of English blood, fall one by one. The once mighty English lion is in retreat. But the disaster in France is merely the match that will ignite a powder keg years in the making. The real roots of conflict stretch back to 1399, when Henry Bolingbroke seized the crown from his cousin Richard II, establishing the House of Lancaster as England's ruling dynasty. Though Bolingbroke, now King Henry IV, secured his throne, the questionable succession planted seeds of doubt about Lancaster's claim to rule. The Duke of York, Richard Plantagenet, watches England's decline with mounting frustration. As a descendant of Edward III through both paternal and maternal lines, York holds a competing claim to the throne. Some say a superior one. As royal blood courses through his veins, so too does ambition. The breaking point comes in 1453. King Henry VI suffers a complete mental collapse, a catatonic state rendering him unable to speak, move, or recognize anyone, even his newborn son. England stands leaderless. Into this vacuum steps Queen Margaret of Anjou, French-born, fiercely intelligent, and utterly devoted to protecting her son's inheritance. Faced with her husband's incapacity, she seizes the reins of power, aligning herself with powerful nobles like the Duke of Somerset and the formidable Earl of Northumberland. The Duke of York, meanwhile, is named Lord Protector during the king's illness, a taste of power quickly snatched away when Henry recovers in 1455. York, dismissed from the royal council and facing the hostility of the queen's faction, fears for his very survival. On May 22, 1455, these simmering tensions boil over. York and his allies, the powerful Neville family including the Earl of Salisbury and his son, the Earl of Warwick, march toward London. At St. Albans, they meet the king's forces. What happens next will echo through English history. The Battle of St. Albans erupts in the town's narrow streets. It is brief but bloody. The Duke of Somerset, York's bitter rival, is killed. King Henry, sitting under a tree singing to himself as the battle rages, is captured. York proclaims his loyalty to the crown while effectively taking control of the government. But Queen Margaret sees through this facade. To her, York is a traitor who has attacked his anointed king, killed loyal nobles, and threatens the inheritance of her son, the infant Prince Edward. The battle lines are drawn, though few realize that St. Albans is not the end, but the beginning, the opening clash in what will become 3 decades of intermittent warfare. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York will soon become symbols of the deepening divide. For the next 4 years, an uneasy peace holds as both sides consolidate their positions. York governs, but Margaret schemes. Noble houses throughout England are forced to choose sides, dividing families and turning neighbors into enemies. By 1459, reconciliation seems impossible. The country descends into what chroniclers will later call the Wars of the Roses, a conflict not of ideology but of raw ambition, personal vendetta, and hereditary claim. It is a war fought not by professional armies but by feudal hosts, where knights and nobles lead men drawn from their own estates into battle against men they might once have called friends. And blood, royal blood, will soon soak into English soil, changing the destiny of a kingdom forever. The fragile peace shatters in September 1459. The Earl of Salisbury, marching to join forces with York, encounters a Lancastrian army at Blore Heath. In the ensuing battle, Salisbury's outnumbered forces triumph, but the victory is short-lived. Weeks later at Ludford Bridge, York's nerve fails him. Facing the king's superior forces, he and his allies flee, York and his second son Edmund to Ireland, while Salisbury, Warwick, and York's eldest son Edward escape to Calais. Parliament, controlled by the triumphant Queen Margaret, attaints the Yorkist leaders as traitors, stripping them of titles and lands. The House of York appears defeated, its ambitions crushed. Yet, within months, the wheel of fortune turns again. In June 1460, Warwick, already showing the military brilliance that will earn him the nickname Kingmaker, lands in Kent with a small force. His charisma and promises of governmental reform attract widespread support as he marches toward London. The city opens its gates to the Yorkists, who then move north to confront the royal army. At Northampton, they achieve a stunning victory, capturing King Henry once again. Somerset and Northumberland lie dead on the field, and Queen Margaret flees with her son to the north. York returns from Ireland, but now the mask of loyalty falls away. In October 1460, he enters Parliament and, to the shock of all present, places his hand upon the empty throne, claiming it as his rightful inheritance. Even his closest allies are taken aback by this bold move. The Lords, unwilling to depose the gentle Henry entirely, broker a compromise, the Act of Accord. Henry will remain king for life, but York and his heirs, not Henry's son, will succeed him. Queen Margaret, in the north, receives news of this disinheritance of her son with cold fury. She will not accept it. In December, York marches north to deal with Margaret's gathering forces. Outside his own castle of Sandal, near Wakefield, he makes a fatal error. Lured into battle on unfavorable terms the day after Christmas, York finds himself surrounded. The Battle of Wakefield ends in disaster for the Yorkists. York himself is killed. His 17-year-old son Edmund is captured and executed on the spot. Their heads, York's adorned with a paper crown in mockery of his ambitions, are displayed on the gates of York City. The Lancastrians seem ascendant, but York's cause survives in his eldest son, Edward, Earl of March. Tall, handsome, and a natural military commander at just 18, Edward defeats a Welsh Lancastrian force at Mortimer's Cross in February 1461. In the sky before battle, a meteorological phenomenon makes it appear as if three suns are rising, a sun in splendor that Edward adopts as his personal emblem, claiming divine favor. Meanwhile, Warwick suffers defeat at St. Albans, losing custody of King Henry, who is reunited with Queen Margaret. The Lancastrian army, now including northern borderers and Scottish mercenaries, advances toward London, pillaging as they go. Terrified of looting, London refuses them entry. Seizing the moment, Edward and Warwick enter London to acclaim. On March 4, 1461, Edward declares himself King Edward IV, stating that Henry has violated the Act of Accord by allowing Lancastrian attacks. Without waiting for coronation, Edward marches north with Warwick to confront the Lancastrian army. The two forces meet on March 29 at Towton in Yorkshire during a snowstorm. What follows is possibly the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. For hours, men hack at each other in blinding snow, the field growing slick with blood. By day's end, perhaps 28,000 men lie dead or dying, an apocalyptic toll in medieval England. The battle ends in complete Yorkist victory. Margaret, Henry, and their son flee to Scotland, then France. Edward returns to London for his formal coronation. At 20, this son of York, tall, charismatic, and battlefield-proven, seems the answer to England's prayers. The first phase of the Wars of the Roses appears concluded, yet the seeds of the next conflict are already being sown, not between York and Lancaster, but between the new king and the man who helped place him on the throne, the mighty Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker himself. For the first years of Edward IV's reign, England enjoys relative stability. The young king proves himself a capable administrator, reforming finances and restoring order. The Lancastrians, though still active in the north and in exile, pose no immediate threat. All seems well for the House of York. Yet beneath this calm surface, tensions bubble. The Earl of Warwick, architect of Edward's rise, expects to guide the young king's hand, perhaps even rule through him. Warwick envisions a foreign policy centered on alliance with France, sealed by Edward's marriage to a French princess. Edward, however, has other ideas. In 1464, he stuns his council with an announcement. He has secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a beautiful English widow of Lancastrian sympathies. This is no strategic foreign alliance, but a love match, unheard of for a medieval monarch. Warwick is furious. The marriage not only derails his French negotiations, but introduces a powerful new faction at court, the Woodvilles. Elizabeth's numerous siblings and children from her first marriage are quickly elevated to positions of power and married into the highest noble families. "The queen's blood must be like a fountain," grumbles one chronicler, "that it suffices to ennoble all England." The Woodvilles' rapid rise alienates the old nobility, particularly Warwick, who finds his influence waning. The king, who once seemed like a protege, now demonstrates increasing independence, governing through men of his choosing rather than the established nobility. By 1469, the relationship between king and kingmaker has deteriorated beyond repair. Warwick, allied with Edward's own brother George, Duke of Clarence, foments rebellion. Using a northern uprising as cover, Warwick defeats the king's forces at Edgecote while Edward is elsewhere. The king himself is captured, and Warwick executes several of the queen's relatives, including her father. Yet Warwick's coup falters. Without a viable alternative to Edward, the country refuses to accept his rule. Reluctantly, Warwick releases the king. Edward, showing remarkable forbearance, pardons both Warwick and Clarence. The peace is short-lived. By 1470, Warwick attempts another rebellion, but finding himself outmaneuvered by Edward, makes the most dramatic alliance of the war. He flees to France and reconciles with his bitter enemy, Queen Margaret of Anjou. The kingmaker will now unmake his king and restore the very dynasty he helped overthrow. Backed by French ships and men, Warwick lands in England in September 1470. Edward, caught unprepared and betrayed by key supporters, flees to Burgundy with his youngest brother Richard and a small band of loyal followers. Without a battle, Warwick enters London and releases the mentally fragile Henry VI from the Tower, restoring him to the throne in what becomes known as the Readeption. For 6 months, England returns to Lancastrian rule, with Warwick as the true power. But Edward IV is far from defeated. With support from his brother-in-law, the Duke of Burgundy, he raises a small force and lands in Yorkshire in March 1471, initially claiming he seeks only his dukedom, not the crown. This pretense is quickly abandoned as support rallies to him. Edward marches south, gathering strength. In London, Warwick finds himself in a precarious position. Queen Margaret and Prince Edward, whom he desperately needs to legitimize his regime, remain in France. His only ally in the capital is the unreliable Clarence, who secretly corresponds with his brother. On April 14, 1471, Edward meets Warwick's forces at Barnet, just north of London. Fighting begins in a thick fog, so dense that the battle lines become disoriented, with some troops accidentally attacking their own side. In the confusion, the formidable Earl of Oxford's men, after successfully pushing back part of Edward's force, returned to the main battle only to be mistaken for Yorkists and fired upon by their own allies. Shouts of treason spread through Warwick's ranks. Panic sets in. As the fog lifts, Edward seizes the advantage, driving into the Lancastrian center. Warwick, seeing the day lost, attempts to flee but is cut down and killed as he reaches the woods. The Kingmaker is dead, but the war is not over. Queen Margaret and her son land in England the very day of Barnet, learning of the disaster only after they arrive. Rather than retreat to France, they push on, gathering support in the staunchly Lancastrian West Country. Edward pursues them relentlessly. On May 4th, the two armies meet at Tewkesbury. Edward once again demonstrates his tactical genius, feigning retreat to lure the Lancastrians out of their strong position. When they advance, they are caught in a devastating flanking maneuver led by Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The Lancastrian army collapses. Prince Edward, the last direct male Lancastrian heir, is killed either in battle or executed shortly afterward. Queen Margaret is captured. And in London, the hapless Henry, Edward IV's second reign brings prosperity and stability to war-torn England. The king, now in his 30s, proves to be a shrewd ruler, rebuilding royal finances and fostering commerce. Yet beneath this golden surface, the seeds of future conflict take root in the complex relationship between the king and his surviving brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Unlike the fickle Clarence, pardoned after his betrayal but executed in 1478 for renewed conspiracies, Richard remains steadfastly loyal. Governing the troublesome northern borders, he earns a reputation for harsh justice but effective rule. Edward rewards this loyalty by increasing Richard's power and lands, making him the greatest noble in the realm after the king himself. Yet Richard watches with growing concern as the Woodville family's influence expands. Though he maintains outward respect for the queen, tensions simmer. The court divides into factions, those allied with the Woodvilles and those who resent their meteoric rise. In April 1483, this uneasy balance is shattered when Edward IV falls suddenly ill. On his deathbed, he names Richard Protector of the realm until his 12-year-old son, Edward V, comes of age. The king's unexpected death sends shockwaves through the kingdom. The young Edward Feave is with his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, when news reaches them. Richard, in the north, immediately pledges loyalty to his nephew, but moves swiftly to intercept the boy on his journey to London. At Stony Stratford, Richard arrests Anthony Woodville and other members of the king's household, taking personal custody of Edward V. Richard assures London that this dramatic action is merely to protect the king from Woodville plots. He escorts Edward to the capital, lodging him in the royal apartments of the Tower of London, then a palace as well as a fortress. The boy's younger brother, Richard of York, soon joins him there. As preparations for Edward V's coronation proceed, Richard makes his move. In a carefully staged presentation, he presents evidence that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid due to a previous marriage contract, rendering their children illegitimate. Richard, as the last legitimate son of Richard, Duke of York, claims the throne for himself. On June 26, 1483, Richard takes the crown as Richard III. The two princes remain in the tower, increasingly isolated. By late summer, they are no longer seen in the gardens or at windows. Rumors spread throughout London. The princes have been murdered. To this day, the fate of the princes in the tower remains one of history's great mysteries. No bodies were produced during Richard's lifetime, though remains discovered in the tower in 1674 have been tentatively identified as theirs. Whether Richard ordered their deaths, or whether they died through illness or other causes, their disappearance stains his reputation irrevocably. Richard's reign begins under this shadow, though he proves an able administrator. Issuing popular legal reforms, many nobles cannot forget the missing princes. Rebellions flicker across southern England in the autumn of 1483, though Richard suppresses them easily enough. But across the Channel in Brittany, a more dangerous threat emerges. Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, sudden becomes the focus of Lancastrian hopes. Tudor's claim to the throne is tenuous at best. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, he descends from John of Gaunt's illegitimate children, later legitimized. Yet, as Lancastrian heirs have been systematically eliminated, Tudor stands as their last hope. More significantly, Tudor pledges to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, uniting the warring houses. This promise attracts Yorkists disaffected with Richard, creating a coalition of convenience rather than conviction. In 1485, with French support, Tudor launches his invasion, landing in Wales, his ancestral homeland. Richard mobilizes quickly, but finds his support wavering. Key nobles, particularly Thomas Stanley and his brother William, whose loyalty Richard distrusts, bring forces but remain uncommitted. On August 22, 1485, the armies meet at Bosworth Field. Richard commands superior numbers, but fatal indecision afflicts his ranks. As battle is joined, Richard spots Tudor with a small retinue, separated from his main force. In a bold gamble, he leads a mounted charge directly at his rival. It nearly succeeds. But at the critical moment, William Stanley's forces, which have held back observing, sweep down against Richard. The king's horse becomes mired in soft ground. Surrounded, Richard fights with desperate courage. His final words, according to tradition, "Treason! Treason! Treason!" Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, dies on the battlefield. His crown, allegedly found under a hawthorn bush, is placed on Henry Tudor's head by Thomas Stanley. A new dynasty, the Tudors, is born. Yet one final challenge remains before the Wars of the Roses can truly end. In 1487, a boy claiming the Wars of the Roses fundamentally transformed England. When the first blood was spilled at St. Albans in 1455, no one could have foreseen how thoroughly this conflict would reshape the kingdom's political, social, and cultural landscape. As the dust settled on Bosworth Field and the last embers of rebellion were extinguished at Stoke, a new England emerged from the carnage. An England that would soon become the foundation for a world power. The most immediate consequence was demographic. The English nobility, once numerous and powerful, had been devastated. Nearly half of all noble families with male heirs in 1455 had seen their direct male lines extinguished by 1487, not just through battlefield deaths, but through executions, assassinations, and attainders. Great houses that had dominated English politics for generations, the Percys, Beauforts, Nevilles, Staffords, were either extinct or greatly diminished. This aristocratic apocalypse created a power vacuum that the Tudor monarchy skillfully exploited. Henry VII, a king with questionable hereditary right, consolidated power by promoting new men. administrators and officials chosen for competence and loyalty rather than birth. The old feudal system, where great lords maintained private armies of retainers, gave way to more centralized royal authority. The first Tudor, notes historian John Guy, converted a bankrupt, ungovernable realm, inherited through usurpation and civil war, into a stable, prosperous state passed peacefully to his son. This transition was not merely political, but psychological. The wars had shattered the medieval concept of divinely ordained kingship. When Richard II was deposed in 1399, it created a precedent that kings could be made and unmade. By the time Richard III fell at Bosworth, England had seen 6 kings in the span of 25 years, 3 of them deposed, 2 likely murdered. The result was a new pragmatism in English politics. Henry VII's claim derived less from blood than from conquest and consent. His marriage to Elizabeth of York symbolically united the warring houses, but it was his victory on the battlefield and subsequent parliamentary approval that truly legitimized his rule. This pragmatic approach extended to governance. The Tudors developed what historians call the Tudor Revolution in government, centralizing authority, professionalizing administration, and establishing more direct control over the localities. Parliament, once merely a gathering to approve taxation, began its long evolution toward a genuine governing partner. Economically, the wars accelerated changes already underway. The old feudal economy, based on land and personal service, continued its slow transformation toward a more commercial system. Many great estates changed hands during the conflicts, often benefiting smaller gentry families who had bet on the right side. Some rose by the wars, but many more fell, noted Sir Thomas More, who grew up in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. Trade and commerce, disrupted during the fighting, recovered quickly under Tudor stability. Henry VII's policy of peace and profit encouraged commercial ventures, laying groundwork for the later explosion of English overseas trade. The decimation of the old nobility created opportunities for merchant wealth to acquire land and status, further blurring medieval social distinctions. Militarily, the wars demonstrated the declining relevance of heavily armored cavalry, the traditional backbone of medieval armies. Artillery and professional infantry, particularly archers, proved increasingly decisive. Henry VII maintained a small standing force of yeoman guards, rather than relying on feudal levies, another step toward the modern state. Culturally, the wars provided rich material for chroniclers, poets, and eventually dramatists. Within a generation, the conflict was already being mythologized. By the time Shakespeare wrote his history plays a century later, the wars had been transformed into a morality tale about the consequences of usurpation and discord. Shakespeare's interpretation, largely based on Tudor propaganda, powerfully shaped subsequent understanding of the period. His portrayal of Richard III as a physically deformed villain, for instance, has proven remarkably durable despite limited historical evidence. For the Tudor dynasty itself, the wars provided both opportunity and obsession. Henry VII spent his entire reign securing his tenuous position, haunted by the specter of Yorkist pretenders. His son, Henry VIII, was similarly preoccupied with securing the succession, an obsession that would lead to religious revolution when his first wife failed to produce a male heir. Elizabeth I, the last Tudor, consciously presented herself as the living embodiment of the Tudor rose, the union of York and Lancaster that had ended the bloody conflict. When she died childless in 1603, the succession passed peacefully to James I of Scotland, a testament to how thoroughly the Wars of the Roses, as we understand them today, exist as much in myth as in reality. The very name, Wars of the Roses, was never used by contemporaries. It appears centuries later, popularized by Sir Walter Scott in the 19th century, inspired by the supposed badges of the rival houses, the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. Yet, historical evidence suggests these floral emblems were not widely used during the actual conflict. The White Rose was indeed associated with the House of York, but Lancastrians rarely used the Red Rose until after Henry Tudor adopted it. The Tudor Rose, combining red and white, was largely a propaganda creation, symbolizing the union of houses through Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York. Similarly, our understanding of the war's participants has been colored by centuries of retelling. Richard III perhaps suffered the most dramatic character assassination in English history. Shakespeare's hunchbacked villain, declaring, "I am determined to prove a villain," bears little resemblance to contemporary accounts. While Richard certainly seized power under questionable circumstances, his 2-year reign showed administrative skill and popular legal reforms. The discovery of Richard's remains in 2012 under a Leicester parking lot confirmed he had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, but not the grotesque deformity portrayed in Tudor propaganda. This find prompted a reassessment of this most controversial king, revealing the complex reality behind the caricature. The conflict itself was not the continuous bloodbath often portrayed. The actual fighting occurred in sporadic bursts, with just 13 major battles spread across 30 years. Most of England experienced extended periods of peace between these eruptions of violence. Casualties, while significant for the nobility, represented a tiny fraction of England's population. Perhaps most importantly, the notion that the wars represented a straightforward dynastic struggle between two coherent factions oversimplifies a much messier reality. Allegiances shifted constantly. The Earl of Warwick fought first for York, then Lancaster. The Duke of Clarence betrayed both his brother Edward IV and his father-in-law Warwick. Many nobles changed sides multiple times, following personal interest rather than dynastic loyalty. These were not wars between roses, historian Michael Hicks notes, but conflicts between ever-changing factions of self-interested magnates. What began as a crisis of kingship under Henry VI evolved through multiple phases, each with different causes and participants. By its end, few could have articulated what the fighting was truly about. Yet, from this complex, often contradictory conflict emerged modern England. The destruction of the old nobility, the strengthening of central authority, the creation of more professional government, all laid groundwork for the nation that would soon build a global empire. The Tudor dynasty, born from the chaos, would rule for 118 years, overseeing England's emergence as a Protestant power and the beginnings of its overseas expansion. Henry VII's grandson, Elizabeth I's father, Henry VIII, would break with Rome, initiating religious changes that still shape English identity today. Perhaps the greatest testament to the war's significance lies in how thoroughly they were mythologized almost immediately. From Thomas More to Shakespeare to modern historical fiction, these events have been retold and reimagined by each generation, reflecting not just what happened, but what we need the past to mean. The blood spilled on those distant battlefields has long since soaked into English soil, but the stories of those who fought, schemed, triumphed, and perished continue to capture our imagination, reminding us that history is always more complex, more human, and more relevant than we might initially believe.